Welcome to Sacred Justice. Sacred Justice is a podcast that features discourse rooted in the pursuit of justice as sacred practice. Our monthly discussions reflect on current events, art, media, theology, and how these things intersect with movements for freedom and liberation. We hope that through these conversations, we can foster inclusivity by expanding our learning opportunities, cultivating digital community from Charlotte, North Carolina, all the way to Washington, D.C., and everywhere in between and beyond. We hope to connect the church's call for social justice and spiritual development as we aim to do the work of liberation and love. And we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Sacred Justice, which is a podcast that the Dr. Boswell and I, DJ Hairless, started in 2021 at Myers Park Baptist Church. And we haven't recorded an episode in like a year because, I don't know, I moved across the country and left him in Charlotte.
Heart is still broken. How dare you?
But we are back. We are back with a series of episodes, and we are putting together some new content to be released at both of our faith spaces so that we can continue to have conversations. And these conversations now, which all revolve around the intersection of faith, public policy, justice, real life issues, they will now be reflecting on our different contexts. You know, me in DC, Dr. Boswell in Charlotte, and all of the guests in between. And we have a guest today, and I'll let John introduce John's self shortly. But we're excited to be back. Ben, how are you?
I'm good. We are definitely still grieving. It's been, 8 months, and the grieving process does not change until the year mark. I passed the year mark of when you told me. So I lit a candle and I drank some bourbon on that day and had like a whole experience with my altar and all the things that I needed to do to process through my deep emotions about your departure. And but then it's coming up on the 1 year anniversary when you told the congregation. So we're going to have another kind of, it's like sitting Shiva for us, like another grief moment of what it's like when you depart. It's like when I left Greenwood Forest, we had like this whole thing. Lauren and I, she was the associate at the time. We like had a drink. We drank some gin, and had like a ceremonial moment. So I'm having to have that again. But I'm really glad. It's like feels like reunited and ready to do some more good trouble again. And what I'm excited about is the opportunity to like have more than just the Myers Park faith context as the sort of experimental ground in which we're, embodying this theology and justice and trying to figure out how to work with people in congregations as they're trying to be, justice seekers in their context. And so I felt like, when we were doing the podcast before, it was very focused on Myers Park, and now we have this opportunity to really talk about multiple faith contexts.
Yes. Good. Yeah, that's good. I'm excited to be back as well. For those of you who don't know, I'm Reverend Mia McLean, and we didn't really introduce ourselves for the new listeners, but I serve as the senior pastor at Riverside Baptist Church in DC. And John, I would love for you to introduce yourself to the listeners. They'll hear more from you later.
Yeah, I'm Dr. John Blackshire. I call myself lately a social justice coach. I was trying to figure out how to sum up the work that I do and the work that I'm trying to do. But mainly I'm just an educator and a minister, and I go around and I tell people how hopefully we can be more like Jesus as it pertains to like doing justice here on this planet. So I'm trying to keep it short and concise. So I think that sums it up. So I'm doing some work with Ben in Myers Park this summer while I finish my MDiv. So I'm really excited to be around them and learn. So.
Yeah. And then you are the
I am chief troublemaker in Myers Park Baptist Church, and yes, senior minister there. Been here about 8 years, and had the great honor to work with Bishop McLean at one point. She was on staff, and now getting to serve at her feet, as we work together in this world. So, and John, really glad you're here for this conversation. We're gonna have some fun.
Yeah, I'm
Let's have some fun.
excited. Yeah, I'm excited.
Well, let's start with a check-in. It's been a year since we recorded. I guess we did a series last summer, maybe, or something we released last year. We're reflecting on some things, but what has, I mean, besides my departure, what has been going on in the world of Charlotte, Myers Park, the justice that you all are trying to do in the city of Charlotte and beyond? What's percolating?
Well, I think Charlotte is like a lot of places in America, still the same hellscape it was when you left. Um, the shortage of resources and the way in which people are being impacted by racial capitalism right now in this moment. Not to throw a big term out early, but like it feels like there's more people living in housing insecurity. There's higher level of demand on all the nonprofit organizations. There are people coming to the church continually still in greater need. It feels like more and more folks who are privileged are. I feel like every day that goes by that we have not, left our homes and gathered in the streets to burn the whole thing down and start over is another day where we are trained in a logic of denial. And so I feel like I see white folks, particularly that I work with, but a lot of others just, kind of like, well, it's just another day. Things just keep getting worse. And that's just America. And nothing I can do about it except go home and turn on the TV, watch some Succession. And, that's just escape from all this mess. And so I keep trying to provoke, like what I keep doing, and I'm getting some traction on this, but not what I want. But anytime somebody says to me something about like, oh, this mass shooting or that, I just say, do you think people understand how bad it is? And they're usually like, no, I don't. I'm like, do you know how bad it is? Like I try to get it personal, and they're like, yeah. And I was like, well, why? How are we not like just running like with pitchforks and flames, like just to say this is enough, we're done, we can't live like this. And I think, of course, the culture is structured in such a way to make us want to forget that, distract us, put us in a logic of denial, make us think that things are better than they actually are, segregate us away from the problem so that we don't have to see it, so we don't have to feel it. And I see that happening continually here in Charlotte. We're just kind of on pace as a city to just say that we care about money and not people. And I wish we would kind of just say it. But, like it's like we're going to build another stadium. We're excited about the soccer team. We're excited about our new quarterback. We're excited about the draft pick that the Charlotte Hornets have. We're excited about all these things that we think are going to bring the city revenue and money, but people are dying on the streets and we can't make any changes. It seems like it's intractable around that. So that's what I see. I will also say, in addition to that, I just want to bring one other intersection into it. I see a continued attempt to, what I see as an attempt to destroy public education in America, which is this, this whole anti-wokeism, social panic. And I think that we see that social panic as something that like is about race or LGBTQ, which it is, but it's also about destroying one of the last public institutions that we have, that people have, as a part of the welfare state that's left and remaining. And when 150 people sign up to speak at the local school board meeting just to talk about, Amanda Gorman's poem, that's not just happening in Florida, that's happening in local school districts. We're so far beyond absurdity that it's hard to even recognize what's happening. But I'm trying to frame it for folks as like, I think they're trying to destroy the public school system. That's what I see. We now have our first religious school, a religious charter school that's been given for the first time ever public funding. It's a Catholic school, but they have now got public funding, and that's never happened before. And I think this has been the attempt all along, is as a continued attempt to destroy anything public that we have left in our society. So that's what I'm seeing. What are you seeing, me?
Woo, that's a lot, Ben. And, it reminds me, I've been doing a little bit of work or discernment around my my possible next academic venture. And it's really around creating educational spaces outside of the public school institution. So what is it like for the church to reclaim its rightful place in the community as the chief educator of particularly Black and Brown children? Because that's where we learn things that we did not learn in school. You know, this is where we learn the principles of Kwanzaa, the Nguzo Saba. This is where and those principles have moral. I mean, we can say things about like, oh, the founder of the Kwanzaa movement, it was this, that, and the other, and, you know, all these people who are problematic, but the actual principles of the Nguzo Samba that talk about self-determination and creativity and economics, cooperative economics, we were learning that in church. The church was the first freedom school before freedom school became a thing that, you know, that became about reading. The church was the site of that. And so how do we reclaim our space and community as educator? Because we're already seeing that the schools don't care about arts education. They're pulling those resources, particularly in poorer communities. They don't care about literacy for children in certain communities. And so we have a responsibility now to address that need again. And so you were saying that made me think of some things that I've been wrestling with in this particular community in Southwest DC. Well, you know, I moved here 9 months ago. I live in Anacostia, which is a neighborhood that has historically been Black and also has had a lot of challenges because people have divested. The government has divested it from the neighborhood. So a lot of challenges. But I was like, I'm going to live in Anacostia. It's 10 minutes from work. I'm from New Orleans, so there are certain things that don't scare me about crime and stuff. It's whatever. I got carjacked when I was 5. I was like, you just gotta keep your eye open. But yeah, so living there, I get to see a lot of the first, like the real time stuff happening. You know, up the block. On my particular block, there's not much going on, but like 2 blocks over, 13-year-olds getting arrested for carjackings and 12-year-olds going missing because they're out in the street and people getting shot, right? So there's a systemic challenge going on, particularly in the Section 8 part of that block, Section 8 housing part of that block, because divestment, you know, educational, it's just a mess in Anaconda. The schools are ranked terribly. So unless you go to one of the charter schools, the few charter schools in Southeast DC, unless you can get into a charter school, you're going to a school that's ranking is 2 out of 10. Like that's just, you know, that's just your option. So of course these kids have a lot of truancy challenges. So just this morning, DC hit its 101st murder homicide of the year. This is the first time in 20 years that we've gotten to 100+ murders this soon in the year. So there's all this panic, you know, people are panicking, but I mean, half of them are in Southeast DC. So I'm like, I'm not surprised or shocked by the number, but so that's happening right now too. There's all this new development, which you saw when you came to DC, all this new development, and there's also just like a lack of resources. And so what I have been trying to notate as I've been doing the community mapping as a pastor is what is a DC organization that's helping people and what's like the Hill. So, and this is no shade to any of the groups. We work with some of them, but like Bread for the World is not an organization that I'm going to when somebody has a food crisis. They're doing something on some like other national level that is not quite trickling down to the people who have immediate crisis. So the immediate crisis for like a food insecurity would be go to like Martha's Table or one of the so others might eat, right? So trying to pick apart what is DC and what's Washington is like my challenge. A pastor that I met with really early on, the Reverend Dr. Bill Lamar, who pastors at Metropolitan AME, he said he had to decide after his first 2 years of pastoring in DC that he was not going to be a Washington pastor. He was going to be a DC pastor. He's like, I serve the people who are local. I'm not trying to be in the prayer breakfast in the White House. I'm not trying to, you know, because he was doing a lot of that. People were calling him. He pastors a historically Black church. But your time gets consumed with all of this like high level stuff that you're not seeing trickle down. I can't call the people at the White House when somebody comes to the church and they need their bills paid, you know? So I mean, and fortunately, I'm not I'm not like I don't romanticize that anyway. So I'm like, I don't need to ever go to the White House. I'm okay. But that's kind of the work that I've been doing the last 9 months, is figuring out who is really for the people and who's just here based in DC, but this is a national organization. So that's kind of the justice challenge right now.
Yeah. That's because every nonprofit organization in the country has some DC headquarters if they are big enough to have a lobbyist that needs to be involved. So they have some kind of DC headquarters, and and there's a lot of these in Alexandria too, not just in DC proper, but in Arlington, Alexandria, places in Maryland. And yeah, you can easily get sucked up into like the global nonprofit industrial complex instead of what will actually make a difference for the folks in your neighborhood. And yeah, I can see that as a challenge. That was really good advice that you got from that pastor.
Yeah. And I was he kind of laid it out for me, and I was like, this is good. And he's an organizer, so this is like kind of what he is about. He works with WIN, I guess the Washington Interfaith Network. Yeah, he does some work with them.
But he's with them when I was there.
You did, yeah. So yeah, up your alley. So yeah,
I like those organizer types.
Yeah.
John, what are you seeing? I know you don't.
It's interesting because I moved to Charlotte 9 months as well. So it seems like when you were leaving, I was coming in. And so I've just been thinking about all the development. And I think you really touched on this as well in both of y'all's kind of comments, but just the ways that, North Carolina is rural country. It's real, lots of fields, lots of trees. And so it's so interesting for me to see how further out of Charlotte is being developed, how many trees are disappearing, how much just kind of organic land that you're just like, oh, I used to drive by there and that used to be a field and now it's a gas station. And I've only been here 9 months. And so for me, I've been startled at the pace, I think, right? So I think moving here from Phoenix, I know what gentrification looks like. I know what development looks like. I know what, the mass exodus from California looks like. And, when you get priced out. But it's been so interesting, just to see the rate, I think, of expansion here. And if you look at the number of how many expats are coming to North Carolina and Charlotte in particular, and I'm one of them, right? I just talked about getting priced out of Phoenix and moving here. And so it's so interesting to see how the numbers in Charlotte are more non-natives. That's where it's trending towards than folks who are actually from Charlotte. And so I'm really interested to see what that does to the politics, what that does to the organizing, what that does to, notions of justice in the city, right? As all these people from everywhere else are making their way to Charlotte. And so I think that's the big thing I'm keeping my eye on as a newcomer to the area. It's like, there's a lot of us moving into Charlotte and its surrounding areas. What exactly does that mean for this place that has so much history and so much going on already?
Yeah. And Charlotte is no longer affordable. I mean,
It's not. We live in the burbs, and we were just talking about like, oh, if they raise this rent, we're gonna have to move. Like, like we're all right now, but if they even go up like $200, like we gotta go somewhere else. And so, it's so interesting just to see how much, regardless of if you're in University City, you're in Kannapolis, like everywhere is just getting built out, and it's just like, okay, I guess we're all going to South Carolina now. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's what's happening now.
Right.
South Carolina is booming,
Yeah.
That
whole region,
Mia knows this story, but back when I was looking for a place to live, after I was coming out of a divorce and looking for a new place to live, I was outbid by cash offers for 3 different properties. You can't possibly compete. Even if you have the money to afford a house, you can't compete with a market where the supply and demand is out of whack, right? And so these folks are getting these property assessments every year that show their property is growing by $58,000 to $100,000 every year.
That happens
so they
to
feel
me.
justified. Yeah, they feel justified in racking up the rent on folks because they're paying more because the property value is going up so much higher. Yeah, that happens.
And then you also. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was going to say, I was just listening to, I'm pretty sure it's NPR, but so many folks in Charlotte are being forced out of their homes because they can't afford the property taxes, right? So as, the values of homes around them go up, their value, and so that was really interesting. Again, you see all of these folks who bought their homes in the 60s, 70s, Black families, brown families, who are now like, I can't afford my property taxes going up $20,000 a year. And so I think that's also, again, what's so interesting. Like, you're talking about these values and these prices and people just being priced out in all these ways. It's fascinating. It's interesting to see. And it's also terrifying, I think, for me. It's like, where are people going to go, especially when they've been there so long?
Yeah. I actually had an interesting situation when I was selling my house, where I was having trouble getting like real buyers. I ended up having to sell to what you call these people, investor, which I didn't want to do, but I had to go. I didn't have a choice. I was like, I got to get out of here. But a lot of people, so there's two things happening. A lot of people were kind of cautious because the interest rates are going up, whatever, right? But people were also saying things like, oh, this is a cute house, but it's really kind of too small. Now, there's this culture now, you move to a city like Charlotte to like have the land, your dream, your American dream, 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom, pool in the backyard. So they, nobody's getting like starter homes anymore. Everybody comes to Charlotte and they want to have like their new construction with, 5 bedrooms. And so my 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house was not good enough for for a couple of people. They were like, it's just a little too small, 1,300 square feet. Now, I used to live in New York, so 1,300 square feet was like heaven when I bought my house in Charlotte. But there's this culture of excess that is uncomfortable to me. It's preached in church, in churches, this prosperity. God wants you to have more. Go and get the thing go take back what the devil stole from you. This kind of this culture of God wants you to have bigger and better. And that trickles down to our housing market, right? So the people aren't content anymore with the little starter home. They're going to buy it and then tear it down and build something big that is not in the character of the neighborhood, that messes up all of the aesthetics of the neighborhood. It's challenging. It's challenging.
It's like going back to that dissonance happens when you go back to the home you grew up in. Sometimes, like my grandparents' home, that my grandfather built with his own hands, it's got 2 bedrooms and it's one story, and they added on like a back patio, but like that's it. And they raised 3 kids there. And I remember when I was my first church in Alexandria, there was a house even smaller than my grandparents' house that had maybe 3 bedrooms in it total, and like 1 or 1.5 baths, and it was all one, brick ranch style house, right? They raised 10 children in that house, 10 children, and it's like when I was in it, I was like, where were all these children? Like, I don't understand where they were. How they even, like, were they all in the living room just sleeping on the floor? But I think that was the way life was. People lived with big families in small houses. Now we live with small families in huge houses.
Yeah.
And there's no way that is possibly sustainable, right?
It's not. So we have a housing crisis. Well, if you keep building like 5,000 square foot homes for 2 people to live in there, then of course you have a housing crisis.
Yeah. I mean, it's also, you think about the statistic that there's enough empty houses in America for every unhoused person to have their own home. Not even just like every family, but you could just like give the baby a 3-bedroom if you wanted to, And it's just like, when I think about that, I'm just like, there can't be a housing crisis. There's obviously some like greed crisis. I think is what you're getting at, Mia. You know what I mean? And just like the excess and just like the nonsense. But I just remember the first time I heard that, and my mind was just blown. Like, okay, yeah, we really got some things like backwards in America, because that's unnecessary, to say the least.
It is, and it's a culture, and it gets perpetuated in church. But along with that, as we go into our episode and we do some current events as usual, we jump from housing crisis, housing insecurity to climate crisis. It's one crisis stacked on top of the other. So if you're
all this stuff is related, though, right? It's all related at some point.
All related. So if you've been keeping up with the news, there is a air quality alert in most of the Northeast corridor by now. So it hit DC probably yesterday, but it started in New York. Not started in New York. That's a lie. it got to New York City, which when it got really popular on TV, because nobody cared when it was in Rochester or like Binghamton. But the smoke, the forest fires that are happening in a part of Canada right now, I think Quebec, they are coming south. So the smoke from that is coming south, and New York is like at extreme alert right now. DC is on orange alert. So we're not at the red zone yet, but we're getting there. They said tomorrow, which means they're going to be telling people don't come outside if you don't have to, yada, yada, yada. What are your thoughts on this from both a faith perspective and a human perspective, as we see, particularly as they're saying things like, get your mask out. Now, this is after they've said we don't need masks anymore for COVID, and, everything stopped being free. So now they're wanting us to go back to wearing our N95s, which I stocked up on, so I have them. What are your thoughts on this from a faith perspective and a human perspective?
Whew. Well, and we've talked about environmental justice before. I think this now for me, there was an article today, like a little quick opinion piece, a 5-minute read in the Times that said something like, the sky darkens and the future becomes clear. And I thought, that's right. Like, these apocalyptic moments are both terrifying and revealing. They continue, like COVID was, like the murder of George Floyd was, like January 6th was. I could go on and on about all the continued apocalyptic moments we've had just in the last 3 years, that we've all been living through. Like, they're just little blips on the radar now. Like, we used to have like 9/11, and then we went 20 years or something without something that was an existential crisis. Now we go through existential crises every 3 months, or sometimes less than that, every day, if you think about mass shootings, for instance. But like, I think that's what I liked about the article, mostly the title more than the writing. But like, I love the idea that, like, yeah, no, every time something like this happens, we have to be ready to see what the future holds, because there's it reveals both what we've done to the planet, what we've done to the world through our hubris, through our calloused kind of, aggressive late stage capitalism. It reveals I think it reveals the impotence of the Christian faith to deal with the largest moral issues that we have. And let's say the impotence the current Christian faith has, the majority Christian faith has, to deal with the largest moral and existential crises of our time. Otherwise, these things would be the kinds of things that lead churches to completely abandon their current paths and begin to focus in new areas that will be things that are reducing harm and creating trauma-informed spaces for healing, and clearly protesting and standing against, policies that are continuing to make things worse instead of better. And I don't see that happening for the majority of churches. And so I wonder how does the faith speak to these kinds of things? The article is really kind of saying, like, this is what the future will look like as climate change continues. We will have months on end where you won't be able to see the sun because the environment, the smoke, the pollution, whatever's happening, we won't be able to see the sun. We won't be able to breathe. We will have to stay inside. That's worse than COVID in some ways, and it may not last as long. But, and I think the more and more opportunities that happens, the more and more anarchy, political anarchy, and civil unrest is going to occur in relationships. Some of which will be good and lead the world to becoming more just. Some of which will be negative and be a consolidation of some of the worst forms of white nationalist, capitalist violence. So that's kind of what I'm seeing in that.
Anything from you, John? I mean, I'm not sure. I guess it hasn't hit Charlotte yet, but
today's the worst air quality of the year for Charlotte. So it has. We're advised not to run today. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I used to, when I was a professor, I was in upstate New York, and so I have a lot of friends, and that's where I met my partner. And so like I often like stay connected, and so I had a lot of friends text me like, "Oh, we're not taking the baby out," and just like various ways that kind of their day-to-day interrupted. I was really struck by what you said no one cares when it's in Rochester, no one cares when it's in, Binghamton, these kind of like smaller places, and thinking about, again, the way that we know pollution and, what am I trying to say? Not economic violence, violence to our ecosystem, right? That we know that violence to the planet, the way that it disproportionately impacts Black and brown bodies and Indigenous bodies, right? And so I was really just thinking about what are the ways and the strategies that we can help those most disenfranchised by this and those in pollution zones. And so I don't have any concrete things right at this moment, but I think that that's what's really on my heart. And I think that that's kind of the next steps for the church at large, is to figure out how do we center the most marginalized as we do this work, so that we can kind of metaphorically lift all boats with us as we try to rise the tide. And also, I think personally, I don't know about you all, but I've been trying to figure out, how do I keep my optimism? How do I keep my joy in all of it? Right. Again, I talked about moving here from Phoenix, and one of the reasons that we left Phoenix was the heat and how hot it was and how unbearable it was, and the lack of water. And so they're saying by 2050 Phoenix will be inhabitable, right? That's not that far. And so it's just really terrifying to feel, again, I know it's hot out here, y'all got humidity, I don't want to downplay that, but it's something about it being 125 that your brain chemistry starts to do some different things, and your body literally starts to feel different ways. And so just thinking about, the number of deaths that are caused by this, and, just all the intersections. And so I definitely think that those are our next steps as a church, is like, what do we do specifically to get people out of the heat, out of the smoke, out of the pollution, and into cleaner spaces. Because it's death, literally, for so many folks, right? It's death. And so anyway, I can go on rants, but I'm just thinking about that, because even when we're in public, right? If you're, again, I'm going back to Phoenix, or even if you go to New York where it's really cold, there's no outdoor spaces that are safe, right? And Phoenix is too hot, and upstate, New York, it's too cold, right? And so what do we do for people's actual physical bodies to get them somewhere so they can be less exposed? And so that's something I'm going to be praying about and trying to meditate on, and try to figure out, how can I be more involved with that physical step.
Yeah. I've been wondering, adjusting the church programming. I remember when it snowed in Charlotte, Ben, you were on sabbatical, and we were all like, are we having worship or not? So we ended up canceling, just going online. We went online, virtual. But there was a time when people would just kind of thug it out and like walk to the church house, and that's not possible in the same way anymore, because we live farther and we're driving, and there's just a different set of circumstances to get from one place to the next. And we saw that in Buffalo, unfortunately, when people were dying in their cars in that snowstorm in this past December, coming from work. That woman, the young girl, was coming from work when she got trapped in her car in that blizzard. So are we adjusting our programming, or are we just going to kind of succumb to capitalism and the myth of productivity? Or we have to do it because we got to do this and that, we got to do that. I'm like, if the smoke is still bad on Saturday, are we still having a Capitol Pride Parade? Because if you cancel it, that's fine. Like, I know it's going to suck,
right? That's one of the things that I think is coming up for me as both you and John are sharing, is geography. And I think this is a segue into maybe the next topic that we've got, which I know you want to talk about Cop City, but I think, I've really been influenced by the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's also one of the leading abolitionists in this country and an incredible scholar who has made connections for me that I would never have made on my own. It's really reading her that's helped me understand. I mean, Jennings does this too, Willie James Jennings, but for whatever reason, Ruth Wilson Gilmore has been more clarifying for me, is that churches, theologians don't pay attention enough to geography. And by that, I don't mean like maps. What I mean by that is people live in space. There are no people who don't live in some spaces, right? And I'm not just even talking about the study of land use, gentrification, housing. I'm just talking about space. So like what Helms, the artist here in Charlotte, theologian, pastor, did for us when she was artist in residence a couple years ago, like a baptism water quality art installation that showed the water quality of West Charlotte and the water quality of Myers Park, and showed and the same thing, put the life expectancy of someone in West Charlotte and the life expectancy of Myers Park. There's a map that Clean Air Carolina did that showed the air quality of West Charlotte and showed the air quality of Myers Park. And there are real tangible reasons for this: tree canopy, just the general investment of resources from the city into these areas. I don't think churches and theologians are paying enough attention to geography, right? We've gotten a little further to people like dealing with bodies. I see a lot of theology about the body, this body, that body, how these bodies show up, the hierarchy of bodies. What I don't see enough of are theologians dealing with bodies in space, as if bodies, it's a lot of talk about like bodies as if bodies can be separated out from space and talked about abstractly, as if they're not uniquely linked to the space in which they come from and live on and occupy. And so this is where Gilmore has really helped me. And of course, she goes from being a geographer, right, to an abolitionist, a prison and police abolitionist, which leads us into a conversation hopefully we can have about Cop City, Mia. So I don't know if you want to start us there, but I think that I'm like, one of the things that she's helped me see that others are talking about is it's, for whatever reason, the logic, the immoral, carceral logic of American society says it's easier to build prisons than housing, right? It's easier to incarcerate than to house in American society. Easier might not be the right word, right? I didn't want to say cheaper because it's actually not cheaper. It's like, what's the word? Expedient, maybe, or whatever it is about American society. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I think it's just more profitable if like we're just being like blunt honest about it, right? Like, what are like the benefits of housing people or the benefits of private prisons? You know what I mean?
Right.
As you were talking, I was thinking about there's some cool Black cultural geographers. Rashad Shabazz is definitely someone folks should check out. Ricardo Milhouse at the University of Alabama. Both Black queer folks who are, like you said, thinking about this relationship of bodies in spaces and bodies in kind of in power structures. But specifically Shabazz, he talks about public housing in Chicago and how public housing in Chicago is set up to mimic, right, prison structures, and how literally he goes from Chicago to New Jersey to DC, right? He goes across the country and he looks at the ways that even when the state does build housing, they do so in a way that mimics the prison system, right? And so that the carceral logics, or even when we're housing you, hard air quotes, right? We're still doing so in a way that we can police you, that we can surveil you, that is inconvenient for you, that is, that is inaccessible, right? That food, in pollution areas, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's so interesting to hear you again, say like, yes, this is where the church needs to go, because even when we look at the public housing, right? Mia, you brought up that those couple blocks of Section 8 and how they function a little different than your neighborhood, right? And so I really just appreciate you bringing that up, because what a direction for the church to go, especially when we think about even outside of the prison system, our public housing is set up to mimic it, right? And you brought up education earlier. You can see the same, like he talks about the setup of the school cafeteria and the setup of the prison cafeteria, right? And so it's all really, anyway, so I'll stop because that's Shabazz's book, not mine. But it's good stuff.
Good stuff.
As again, as we like think about where the church is going and the conversation it should have, because it's fascinating. It's really fascinating stuff.
And how that's good. Thank you, John. Because how does the church, particularly churches that want to build affordable housing on their campus, how do they do so in a way that doesn't mimic public housing, but actually creates a community for people to be a part of and feel a sense of ownership in? That's just an ongoing, I have some ongoing ponderings on that. And maybe that's another episode, because DC is, my church redeveloped many years ago and we did not take the landlord route. And I'm glad we didn't, because that's just a lot. It's a lot. But, you know, there are some people who said we should have built affordable housing. But how do you do that? And these corporations that are working with you are basically building public housing looking buildings on your campus. They're not building community. They're building, anyway, we can go on and on. I do want to touch on Cop City. When you brought up the carceral logic, I want to touch on Cop City. For those of you who have been keeping up or not, I'm on the fringes still, so I'm not an expert. So I keep up, but I'm not an expert. So do your own research. But there, for many years, there have been organizers fighting and protesting against the building of a, what do we call it, Ben? Training facility for police.
There you go.
In Atlanta, or the Atlanta metro area. And this training facility got nicknamed Cop City because it mimics a city. So a lot of what you were just saying, John, they're going to build stuff on site that looks like the projects. They're going to build stuff on site that looks like public housing, that looks like certain neighborhoods, and they're going to practice policing in these like real life. It's almost like Tyler Perry. I don't know if y'all know Tyler Perry.
We know Tyler Perry. Stop playing.
Some people listening might not, but the playwright and he built this whole campus for his studios in Atlanta that mimic real cities and things. So he has like a real White House on his property and some other things. So it's like Tyler Perry, but for cops. Like they're going to get practice policing. And so the worry is nationally. Now you may say this doesn't bother me. I don't live in Atlanta. The worry is if this is greenlit, which it was last night or 2 nights ago, if this is greenlit, that's a model for other cities across the country to do the same thing. So just because it's in Georgia and you live somewhere else does not mean that it's not going to eventually affect you. So people have been protesting. An actual person was murdered by, allegedly, don't nobody come sue me. The young person was murdered for protesting on the land that is where this site will be built. So there's additional stuff for that. There was a raid in a house last week for some people who are raising bail money for people affiliated with Defend the Forest. So the vote passed where they're going to build this thing. And so people are very heartbroken and upset. What is our responsibility as people of faith to respond? And I asked this with the caveat of my friend who is a pastor who basically called Raphael Warnock out on Twitter. She was like, this is from a Spelman sister to a Morehouse brother. You are not standing up for the people in MLK's city. And she felt like he could have done more and wielded his power and his influence more because he is the senator. And he's a pastor. So what is our response as faith people?
Wow. Well, it's a shame that the city council passed that 11-4 on Monday. But what's not a shame is the thousands of people that showed up to protest it, not just from Atlanta, but from all over. That was a beautiful thing. And some of the folks who were at the center of that protest, speaking and leading chants, we were able to have the chance to be in solidarity with them when we were at the Alliance gathering in Atlanta and got to meet some of them and got to support and learn from them. And that is an experience that had a really profound impact on me in my time down there. What I learned, a couple things, I just want to add a few more pieces. Folks all around the country who don't think that it's going to affect them. Cop City is not just a training center for Atlanta police. It's going to be a training center for all police departments in America. Police are going to come from all over America to be trained there in these new urban warfare tactics. And it's very similar in a different kind of way, in a more domestic way, to another school that was in Atlanta called the School of Americas. The reason I know about the School of Americas is because I trained there when I was in the Army. The School of Americas was often protested by religious communities because it was a training ground where we trained people in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency tactics to go back to places in Latin America and Central America and Mexico to oppress uprisings and movements for liberation there, including at one point, the School of the Americas explicitly had a tag on their website that said that they were creating soldiers to stamp out liberation theology in Latin America. They named liberation theology specifically in the School of Americas. This school is eventually, they changed its name. It had so much bad press and so many protests that they changed the name, but the school still exists. It was a place where American soldiers and soldiers from Nicaragua, Colombia, other places in Central and South America would come to train on these American tactics of warfare, counterinsurgency and counterterrorism tactics. So what's happening now again in Georgia with Cop City is a very similar thing, but for a domestic purpose. And the reason I think that this is important to point out is because it reveals what some abolitionists have been trying to teach us, and me specifically, I've been reading on this, is that policing in prisons in America is already a form of warfare. We have been pretending it's not warfare, but it's a form of warfare on Black and brown and indigenous people. And the police in prisons have been at war with Black, brown, and indigenous people for a long, long time. And so this is just another example, and it's just more blatant and obvious that they're training people for warfare in Black communities and brown communities. And here's the other thing. This is for the white liberals listening. When you think about getting, what are the kettling that experienced in Charlotte and other places where they were in New York City that police did that led to a bunch of people being injured and harmed that were just protesting using their, First Amendment rights of protest, and some of the tear gas and the poisoning that's happening that police did during the protests that happened after George Floyd. Those tactics are learned tactics that all come from the same manual and the same place. So when you're out in the street in any city in America, protesting anything, whether it be for abortion rights all the way to Black Lives Matter, and everything in between, the police will be interacting with you based on tactics they learned at Cop City. So anybody who is protesting anything in the history of America, it has an investment in making sure Cop City doesn't exist, because it's really being set up in reaction to the George Floyd protests as a way of teaching and training police how to better subdue and suppress protest. So I see it as un-American, not even just as I have a problem as an abolitionist with police in prison, but even if I didn't, I would see Cop City as un-American based on First Amendment rights, as somebody who believes in the right for an American to protest. So I feel like and of course they're destroying the largest urban forest, right? So it's not just about prisons and police and race, but they're destroying the largest urban forest that is basically the lungs of Atlanta and many other areas around there in order to build this. And I was already witness to some of the catastrophic environmental damage that they've done already with water runoff that they promised not to do. That has already had a big problem right now, and more to come. And that's how, Tortuguita and the protesters who occupied the forest are trying to protect that forest from the very thing. What I see happening, and I'm going to stop here because I want to hear from y'all about this, but I see Cop City becoming like Dakota and Occupy Wall Street. This is the only joy I can come out of it, because it feels like it's the center of the world right now. It is where police, prisons, racial capitalism, environmental justice, there's actually a battle for trans justice happening through Cop City because of some of the treatment of protesters who were non-binary and trans being sent to prisons, that were places of harm for them. So it is the heart of many intersecting justice movements coming together at the same place. So perhaps out of that will come a galvanized movement of many people.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Thanks for the further clarification, Ben. John,
I just wanted to make sure we got some of that.
No, I was thinking about making sure I was remembering your original question, because Ben just dropped so many gems real fast. I think the role of the church as it pertains to is really, I think, the education piece and the community formation piece, right? So, and the way that, Ben just let us know so much of what's going on. And I was just reading about how the fine print of this is that the investment number is way higher than they originally said, because they're allowed to invest an additional $1 million a year for the next 20 years after it's built, right? So we're actually talking 20 million more than the number, that we were originally told. And so I think for us, using spaces like this, using spaces in the pulpit, in the community, our annual alliance meeting, etc., right, to actually, what are the actual facts happening here? Because I think, Ben, you really started to get to it, right? Regardless of if you call yourself an abolitionist, I think that there's some like, this is just, even if you maybe are more conservative, this might rub you the wrong way, even if you're just like a good old libertarian worried about your rights to freedom, right? There's concern about the increase of surveillance and cops in this country from actually a lot of different political pockets.
Yes.
And I think realizing that we all have an investment in this, even if the reason we have an investment might be different. There's a lot of us who, stand to, as been said, right, like receive harm from the building of this. And so I think, in addition to the education, what are we doing to make sure folks have solace in community as they're experiencing the real harm that's coming from the building of Cobb City and from the policing in other places, right? So I was just talking to a friend, and we were talking about, it's literally community or die at this point, right? It's literally, how are we taking care of each other, or the police state wins. And so I think for us as a church, like, what are we doing about our services? What are we doing about our spaces and our shelters and our outreach? Those are like the two big pillars for me as I think about Cobb City, is taking care of folks. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the education that we did at the Alliance of Baptist Gathering in April was a start for people to even become aware and understand. I knew I was hearing about it, and I remember, am I saying the name right, Tortuguitu?
Mm-hmm. I think Tortuguita, yeah.
Gita, when they were murdered, I remember it sort of exploding on my timeline and going deeper into it. But it's a lot of information. It's a lot of information. And so we have a responsibility, again, the church as educator, right? Because you're not going to get it in school. So then where do we step up to the plate in Sunday school, or, youth hour, or whatever, faith formation, spiritual formation, whatever, right? How do we step up to the plate and start to incorporate these conversations into our spiritual formation? Because they are important. This is not an isolated thing. We don't live, isolated pieces of ourselves. Before we run out of time, it is Pride Month nationally, June. We're recording this in June. And at least in DC, I know in Charlotte, you all don't do your big stuff until really August. But in DC, it's full. This is Pride Week. I mean, it's like we're all marching toward the parade on Saturday. And also, there's been some stories in the news. I'm going to read this that I found earlier. It's a quote from a person who was reflecting on the recent Target scandal, the scandal where they removed the clothes because some people complained about what they normally complain about. And this person, I'm reading from miss.modern.rev on Instagram. They said, the Target Pride merch fiasco makes me think of two things. As queer people, we should have never had to rely on a corporation to make us feel seen. And how sad that even corporate love, in quotations, is taken away by violent hatred. Lord, give us real circles of love and acceptance. Remind us our dignity cannot be bought or sold. We are not trends to predict or liabilities to consider. Our vibrant colors can never be pulled from the shelf. And again, that is from @miss.modern.rev. I know you all have a lot of mixed thoughts, but John, I want to start with you first. From your reflections that were on social media regarding National Pride Month, Pride in general, all of the commercialism and capitalism that's been wrapped up in it. Take it away.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I'm a pretty critical guy. So it doesn't take much to just make me angry and start yelling about things. But Pride in general, at least, this capitalist. I was just reading, we're actually, I guess, if you're on some Marxist theory, past late stage capitalism, we're in some other form of just techno, four people hold all the wealth. And so thinking about that, I think this Target situation really sums up that we're really in a place in our world where pink pimping is a real thing. And so the National Black Justice Coalition, they have a lot of great information about quote unquote pink pimping. But you see this, right, where organizations, even some churches, right, businesses, for the month of June, we're here, we're queer, but there's no actual examination on the way that their practices are aiding in the deaths of the people that they claim to care about, right? And so as Target is putting up this live, laugh, lesbian t-shirt, right, there's nothing to look at the policies. I actually kind of love it, but that's a whole different conversation. That catch me 10 years ago, I would have been rocking that. But anyway, right, trans guy jokes. But this way that, right, there's no examination of how Target's policies, there's no examination of how them as a company are actually forcing many trans people to die, right? The way that they're locking up baby formula, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think for me, there's just this frustration with, in this moment where trans people are this new moral scare, right? Where we can't pee in public, where we can't get a book at the library, when we can't be in the pulpit, when saying our pronouns gets you fired from a college, right? What's the point of putting us in this kind of perfunctory, allyship when you're not willing to stand beside us and actually take bullets, right? And so for me, I think there's this tension between, are you a performative ally who just says like, yeah, I hope you don't die? Are you an advocate standing beside me and taking the hits? And so I think that there's a lot of tension there. And if I'm being honest, there's a lot of work to still be done for a lot of folks, even myself, right? I have a very privileged trans life compared to my other trans brothers and sisters. And so what are we actually doing to make sure folks are safe and living? So, I mean, that's my soapbox for the month. But yeah.
Thank you for that. Definitely need to hear that. And the piece about the work continuing too, John, which I think I've talked to Ben about. We've talked about this for Myers Park, and I'm talking about it with my church, Riverside, DC. Just because you became open and affirming in 1992, which is our story, don't mean that you finished. We got work to do with these gendered bathrooms in here. But go ahead, Ben.
When are folks gonna get that? Like, it doesn't stop. I used this before, and I think people don't like it, but whatever. Like, there's no once woke, always woke. I don't even like the word woke, but even if there was a thing called wokeness that's real and it's not a panic, there's no once woke, always woke. There's constant evolution that has to happen, and nobody seems to be. That's, I think, if the church could do one thing, right, it would be to help people realize that you are never a finished product, and that even if you were arm in arm with Malcolm X, I'm not talking about Martin Luther King, even if you were arm in arm with Malcolm X, if you are not always doing the work every year, by now, because the world keeps moving further toward fascism, you could be fascist, even if you stood with Malcolm X. That's how things work. And that's where this, what I keep trying to teach people is we're in a place of constant regression. The sea tide of the world is pulling us out to fascism. And if you're not vigilantly working against it, resourcing yourself with education, resourcing your congregants with what they need to know, then you're going to keep going backwards. Even if you think you're standing at the same place, you will really, and that's even worse, to think you're standing at the same place, but actually to be far more conservative, even possibly fascist than you were by doing nothing except just standing in the same place. And I think that's where I feel like churches we've dropped it. We've got to stay vigilant.
Yeah, I appreciate what you just said. And I think that's so important. And I just had this idea of how do we get churches in conversation with each other to be mirrors to each other, right? Because it's sometimes just hard to kind of know where you're standing because you're the embodied person in the space, right? And so how do we have these conversations where we gently pull people along with us, or they pull us to the left or right, or wherever we need to go? Because I think that's really the next step, is to say, hey, I don't think you think where you think you're at, and let me get you over here, and let's be in community together with it. Because it's hard work, and it's especially when your community isn't primarily queer, right? Mm-hmm. When that is not the center of your leadership, or that's not the center of your congregation, it can be hard to have those perspectives. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Well, that's our final note for the day, as we are at time, but I'm glad we got to get into the Pride while the month was still going on, and I wish everybody a safe and healthy Pride season. Be safe out here in these smoky streets. We will be back, though, at least Dr. Boswell and I, but Dr. John, you can come back anytime next time we record. So we look forward to continuing these conversations, and we will see you next time.